So often as business owners and podcasters, we tend to feel like we have to do what everyone else is doing, that we have to show up a certain way. We have to have the email sequence. We have to have our podcast be a certain type of podcast, when in truth, it's up to you to decide how you want to approach your podcast and how you run your business. Today's guest, Becky Mollenkamp, shares how she shifted from places like ConvertKit and an email that was really not making her feel good about emailing to a platform like Substack. And I've always been very interested in Substack, never really delved into it. I've heard of Patreon and people having a podcast Patreon or a podcast circle community or a Mighty Networks community. But how was she able to take these types of subscribers, move them into the podcast, and then also move them into Substack? I wanted to know. So that is what we talk about today. If you're interested in hearing more about how you can show up differently for your audience in a way that feels aligned and feels good, then this is the episode for you. Please join me in welcoming Becky to the podcast. Becky, I'm so excited to have you on the show today. If you could start by telling everyone who you are, what you do, and about your podcast.
Hi, I'm excited to do this too. I am Becky Mollenkamp. I'm an accountability coach. I work with business owners who are experiencing a lot of growth and recognizing that they are burning themselves out. I help them get checked out of capitalism and checked into their values. And my podcast is called Feminist Founders because that's who I work with, people who run businesses who would identify as intersectional feminists or womanists or who just care deeply about equity and social justice.
I love that. I feel like in today's age, feminism has historically, but now too, has like almost this negative connotation to it. So for people who are like, feminism, can you just explain that for us?
Yeah. And this is why the first question on every episode of my podcast is, tell me about your relationship with feminism. And there is a very clear divide between the white women and the women of color. And so that's why I asked that question. And I want to confront it head on and acknowledge it because while my idea of feminism and what I think is feminism, I don't think it's feminism if it's not intersectional, if it doesn't explore all of the intersections of marginalization. I know that historically, unfortunately, there have been many in the feminist movement who have been very exclusive, who have kept people out, who have prioritized white women above all others. That is not what I think of when I think of feminism, and I don't want those feminists to win the title of feminist. I am really trying to say, no, that's not feminism. That is at most caring about white women, right? To me, feminism, in the words of C.V. Harquail, who was on my podcast, it has to be intersectional, meaning it has to explore all of the identities that make up who we are, most importantly, centering all the marginalizations, those people with oppressed identities. It has to be transformative, meaning it has to be about changing the systems that exist and that create those inequities. And it has to be collaborative. It has to be about working together as a collective, a community to create change. It can't be about individuals and just how do I get mine? And so for me, that's what feminism looks like. It has to be all of those things.
Yeah. And that's such a deeper understanding of feminism than I think that I've ever really considered. To me, I've always just approached it as giving everyone the ability to choose what they want to do with their life, how they want to live their life, just the ability to choose, that you're not held back by systems that would want to hold you back from being able to. If you want to be a stay-at-home mom, go ahead, be a stay-at-home mom. If you want to go outside of the home and work, then go ahead and go outside of the home and work. And so, yeah, I love this idea. And also having a very non-traditional, which I love, family dynamic where I'm the breadwinner. I'm the one who works. My husband homeschools our kids. Call him my house hussy. Like he is the homemaker. He puts that on like for his title anywhere that he goes. He's the homemaker. And so I love being able to, especially raising boys, to see that there are so many different ways that they can grow to be men and live in society and whatever really fulfills them, because I'm doing what fulfills me and my husband's doing what fulfills him.
And you see how that doesn't center just women. It's exploring all of us, right? Because the systems as they exist harm men as much as they harm women. And so to me, it's not just about how does this affect women, and most especially not just how does it affect white women, but how do these systems harm all of us? And how do we change that for the better of all of us? And that to me is what it looks like to say, truly, like I'm an intersectional feminist, but also I fully acknowledge that there is a lot of history around that word. And I get why many people don't want to claim it or use it. And I fully respect that as well. And I still have those people on my show too.
Oh, that's cool. So tell me a little bit about this transition that you've made. Let's go back to the beginning of when you've launched your very first podcast to your journey of now.
It's a long journey. I was just trying to tell you right before we started. I can't remember exactly what it was, either 2016 or 17, I think. It was pre-pandemic. I know that it was several years before that I launched my first podcast called Light Bulb Moment, which was at the time I was doing more of what I would say is sort of traditional mindset coaching. Another way of saying that is harmful coaching. I was showing up very much like a lot of the white ladies in the coaching space who haven't yet done a lot of work around understanding anti-racism and understanding all of the various isms that create the dynamics in which we live. And so I was doing mindset work, basically meaning like, hey, fix the way you think about things and everything will be better. And as part of the journey at that time, I was realizing that there seemed to be for a lot of people a moment where things shifted for them. You know, for myself in my life, it was when my brother died. That was sort of my light bulb moment of realizing life's too short to be living a life that doesn't feel good. But everyone had their version of that. And so I wanted to talk to people about what their moment was that helped them sort of make a big change to go where they are now. And so I started with that show back then, and it was an interview based show, kind of like I'm doing now, which is interesting. And I went for a while. I wasn't doing seasons. I was trying to do it every week, and it caught up to me where I was no longer ahead. I was running behind. It was getting overwhelming. It took a lot to edit because it was back and forth with interviews. They were longer episodes. They were about an hour. And eventually I just was so far behind and stressed out by it that I sort of took a pause on, is this really the right thing for me? But I went a few years before that happened.
Then you launched your next one. So this is maybe dating myself in the online space. I remember your podcast, your very first one, because I started listening to podcasts in 2015. And I remember being in like mommy groups and things like that because I was a newer mom, left those pretty quickly when I realized they're not very fun to be in. They tend to just a lot of complaining, which I get. Motherhood is not easy, but that was just not the space I wanted to be in. But I remember engaging with your original podcast and then your next one as well, which is The Gutsy Boss, correct?
Yeah. So I began to realize slowly but surely that what I really wanted to help women do at the time, I was really focused on working with women. I wanted to help them feel more courageous. And I was beginning to understand more about the systems. And I had started doing a lot of that unpacking work back in 2014, but I was doing it mostly internally. And then what was starting to happen by 2017, 2018, 2019 was I was realizing, oh, I've done all this work internally, but I'm not bringing it into my work. My work is still perpetuating a lot of these systems that I now have begun to unpack for myself and realize how harmful they are. And so Gutsy Boss is where I started to begin to shift a bit towards recognizing at least some of that and wanting to begin to explore some of the systemic stuff. And then how do we still remain courageous and gutsy in the face of all of the stuff that's there? Also, I was ready to move away from interviews because it was so much work in the editing and everything else. And so I moved to a much shorter format. They were 20-minute usually episodes, solo episodes, just me talking about some issue, usually related to mindset, but also how that exists inside of the systems. And I went for quite a while with that format for at least another couple of years before, guess what happened? I started falling behind again because I was doing all the work myself and eventually got to a place of like, this is not feeling fully aligned with where I was eventually getting to by 2021, 2022. I was like, this doesn't quite feel like it anymore. And I wondered if the reason I was falling behind, and the same reason from the first one, was one, it's a lot of work, but two, I wasn't as motivated to do all of that work because it wasn't feeling aligned. And so I took a long pause and was starting to think like, do I return to this? Am I not going to podcast? I don't know if maybe this isn't for me. And that was a many, many months break, probably 6 months or so before my current iteration with Feminist Founders.
What were you doing during that time? Because I know you've shifted kind of how you interact with your listeners, how you interact with your audience. What were you doing during that time before you shifted?
I was doing a lot of community building and a lot of exploration of like, what do I really want my business to look like? I was fully done with participating in the systems that didn't feel good in not just personally, but in my business as well. And that meant radical shifts in the way I was showing up and the way I was offering my services and what those offers look like, how I was pricing them, all of that, how I was talking about them. Everything was shifting big time. And the podcast was just like, okay, now where does this fit in? I don't know where this fits in anymore. And so I just wasn't inspired to do it. So it just sat there. And instead I was really focusing on how do I call in the community I really want to be a part of, which for me was like old school, building community space, participating in community space, being on Zoom with real humans, and really thinking about how do I want to approach my work? How do I want to talk about my work? And that by the time the Dobbs decision came out for overturning Roe, that was like, I think the final thing that really pushed me like, I'm done. I don't want to just have this be like how I operate my business, which is where I had kind of gotten to, but I was like, now I want this to be the only thing I talk about with my business. Like, I just want to talk about radical change. And so that was sort of like, that process was just a lot of me going all in and then trying to think about what does that look like for my business. I decided through that to start a podcast, sort of like scrap everything and start fully new with Feminist Founders. And it was totally selfish at the time in my mind. I was like, this has nothing to do with my business. I now see how much it does. But at the time I was like, I just want to have conversations about like radically shifting things. I just want to talk with other people who care about this because I was building this amazing community, meeting all these incredible people who are trying to challenge the systems. And then I'm like, people need to know about your amazing things. And I want to have an excuse to have a long conversation with you about this. So a podcast kind of felt like the thing to do and I knew how to do it. And so it started like with no strategy and just, I want to have these conversations. And it's a really good way to get people to have a conversation with you who might not otherwise when you say it's for a podcast.
Yes.
And so that was where it started. It was just like, I was having these great conversations. How do I have them in a way that I get people to show up and talk about these things?
I'm curious how that felt launching a podcast back in 2016, 2017 versus you said 2022, right? Was when the new one was launched. So how did that
2023 actually. Well, in 2017, although there were a lot of people podcasting by then too, it didn't feel like there was as many people podcasting, which is probably true. I assume you probably know the numbers better than I do, but I assume there were less people doing it in 2017 or whenever that was. And it felt that way. I felt more concerned about the quality and like making a splash and like it feeling more professional or something. I don't know. Like I felt a lot more weight around it, but I think it was also because it felt like there weren't as many and people were going to hear it and it needed to be good. And so it felt more difficult in some ways, as in I felt more pressure to perform, but that may also have just been where I was at that time in my life of feeling like I needed to still perform in some way. But it also felt a lot easier in that it was way easier to get people to like say, oh, a podcast. Okay. I'd love to be on that. And it was easier to get people to share it, get easier to people to talk about it. It was easier to kind of like make a splash when I launched it. It felt mostly a lot easier. Now it feels more challenging marketing wise, right? Because it feels like there's just everyone and their dog has a podcast. And so it sort of feels like, okay, everybody has one of these, big whoop, right? Like it doesn't feel special or different. It feels more challenging to get people to listen, to pay attention, to care. But it also feels easier because for some reason, the bar of entry feels so much lower knowing that everyone has a podcast that for some reason, it doesn't feel like I wasn't as concerned about like studio space and the graphics and just all the stuff. It felt like I could just put this out there. Plus I had experience. So that's another piece that I have to include is like in 2017, I didn't know what I was doing. I was studying and learning and probably taking in too much information, which was making me worry about all of the equipment and all of the things and doing it all right. And now I'm like, I know how easy it actually is to make a podcast. Like it's so simple. Last time I hired somebody to help me with like distributing it because that part scared me. Now I'm like, I can't believe I did that. It's so simple to get it distributed, and the money I spent then versus now where I do it all myself, but it all feels so much easier. So I think that's because of experience, but also just because once you realize everyone's doing this thing, it doesn't feel so special and unique and privileged. And it feels more like, yeah, really anyone can do this truly with nothing but a laptop and a microphone. And it doesn't even have to be a very quality microphone. I prefer to have one because I think it sounds nicer.
Yeah, that's so true. You've now moved all of your subscribers over to Substack. And I've talked to people who have, they maybe have a Patreon or they have a circle community for their podcast, but I've never talked to someone who has a Substack. So for people who are like, well, what is Substack? Can you give us a little background about that? And then what kind of led to that moving everyone over?
I was using ConvertKit. So most people are probably familiar with MailChimp, ConvertKit, Aweber, all of the many people out there that do email platforms, right? So it allows you to send mass emails to your email list and people can receive those and all of that. You can set up funnels. You can do, sales sequences. You can do all the things. You can create lead magnets. And that's what I'd used for years and years. I'd been on ConvertKit for a decade or more. And I noticed right around the same time I was doing all of this, being involved in communities. I'd set the podcast aside. I hadn't started the new one yet. I noticed how much I was starting to have a really visceral and not a good visceral reaction when I logged into ConvertKit to write an email. I could feel the energy from my fingers to the keyboard saying, you jerks, insert another word.
Yep.
Are never going to buy what I'm doing. You're just here to get my free stuff. Screw you. Insert another word. I was that resentful and angry as I'm sitting there going to type emails to people. And I caught myself and was thinking this is not okay. This is not healthy. I should not be resentful of these wonderful people who signed up to hear from me. What is going on? And I just started to recognize that I had gotten so caught up in the how big can my email list get, that I had just was doing all the things to try and get people onto that list. And then those people weren't converting into my customers because they were never going to be my clients. My coaching is not typically going to be the kind of thing that's going to happen through email sequences. I'm not selling a lower cost product. I'm not selling a lot of courses. I was at one time. And when I was doing that, I wasn't resentful of my list. But as my offer began to shift, I was still using marketing approaches that didn't work for me. And that was creating these horrible feelings that if I was standing in front of those folks and they were asking me to talk to them, I would not be like, oh, screw you guys. I'd be like, of course. So I knew it wasn't healthy and it wasn't good. And so I started to explore what is it about this that I'm not liking? And it felt so transactional and it made me feel icky in that I felt like I had to try to sell to them, even though I know they weren't really going to be my customers. I didn't like it. At the same time, this was about 6 months after I had first signed up for Substack, but got scared and walked away because I thought I can't move to Substack because I don't know anybody who's using Substack as their email platform who is not a traditional sort of journalist and writer, right? Not somebody who's running a business. And so I was like, I can't do this. And then I finally, by that December, was like, I can't do this anymore. This is not working with ConvertKit. This isn't working for me to feel this way. And the thing I like about Substack is that it's more explicit in the arrangement between you and the people who are subscribing. It says right up front when you sign up, if you're here for free, cool. Here's what I'm willing to give you for free. And they say, cool, I'm good with just that much because that's all I want is free. And I'm okay just getting this. And then it says very clearly, but if you want to get more of me, if you want me to give you labor, here's what I'll do. If you pay me a very small amount, a cup of coffee a month, $5 for me, that's all mine is. Some people charge a little more. I've never seen more than $8 a month. Then here's what you get. And there was something about that boundary being explicit and in place from the beginning that felt so much better to me than what felt a little bit like this weird manipulation of let me give you this little freebie and get you on my list. And now I'm just going to try to sell you into something more expensive. It was very clear, hey, here's what you get. Sign up or don't. And it's okay. And it helped me feel less guilty about not pouring in as much into people who were just there for free without feeling like I needed to or I was supposed to. And then feeling good about giving more to the people who are willing to pay me a small amount of money. If you're willing to give me $5 a month for my labor, it's such a small amount of money. But yet there's something about that felt very different. In the past, I was paying $50 a month for ConvertKit paying people to give them stuff for free and them not to buy from me. And now Substack's free. They take they take 10%. So, but I'm not paying a monthly fee and I'm getting paid to create content. Not a lot because I don't have a ton of paid subscribers, but I'm getting paid every month to create content. It just feels very different for me. So at the time I started it, it was not for the podcast specifically. It was just, I need to figure out another way to market, but I hadn't made the full switch. I hadn't yet said, I'm going to let ConvertKit go because that was scary. I was holding on to both and trying to decide. And then when I started the podcast, I was like, why can't these things support each other?
Mm.
Right? I knew I didn't want to first of all, I don't have the kind of listenership to go out and get ads or to get sponsors. I also don't want to be beholden to sponsors. I don't want to operate my podcast that way. It doesn't feel aligned with the value system that I'm talking about with my podcast. And then I heard, God, I wish I could give her credit. And I can't remember, and I'm so sorry, whoever you are, but I heard somebody else who was running their podcast. So I am not the only person because I heard someone else do this, who has a Substack list. It's a woman and she's a coach. I can't remember her name. She has a podcast and she has a Substack. And she, at the beginning of every episode, was saying this podcast is sponsored by or is funded by you, the listeners. I mean, honestly, what you hear at the beginning of my podcast is not verbatim, but very similar to what she runs. And so I really should figure out who it is so that I can give her full credit. And I was like, why can't I do that? Why can't I make people aware? I hear people doing it with Patreon all the time. Why not with Substack, right? I'll just send them there. They can subscribe. They can still sign up for free, or they can choose to say, you know what? I like what you're doing. I want to support you. $5 a month. Sure. Because now not only am I supporting the podcast, I'm getting this extra stuff from you. So I decided to try it out and see. And for me, I think it feels so good. It just feels really good, to be able to do that, to have that kind of arrangement with my listeners and with my community. And I have way more subscribers to Substack than I do listeners of the podcast. So the challenge now is to try and bring those people over to the podcast. I could sponsor the podcast on Substack, but that doesn't feel like the right fit for me either. Actually air it on Substack, because some people do. They have podcast hosting capabilities, but that doesn't feel right for me at this time. But I do love the way the two can support each other.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And also just thinking about the self-awareness that it takes, especially when you've been doing something, using a tool for so long. It is so hard to let that go and say, this is not working. I need to find something else that's working for me. And we had someone on the podcast, Karen Page, where she was talking about how your human design impacts your content. But one thing that she said that I think really applies to this is it gets to be easy. So if something feels hard, take a second and look at that. And that's what you did, right?
Yeah, I'm a manifesting generator. I don't know what that says, but somebody who's listening who loves human design is probably going, well, obviously that's why you like this. I don't know enough about human design to know. But the part that too, I just want to acknowledge is the thing that was actually the most challenging was all of the shoulds, all of the quote unquote best practices. People who know me and know my value system, people who agree with my value system, people who challenge norms. I can't tell you the number of people and who continue to push back and say, oh, no, you cannot use Substack as your email platform. Like you just can't do it. That's not going to work. And they're like, can't have opt-ins. You can't have the sequences. You can't have the blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I don't think people understand what I'm saying to you. I don't want any of that. And I get for people who do, yes, do it. But I think you're exactly right. It has to be what feels good and feels easy. And that stuff had become such a burden. So overwhelming and stressful, and none of it felt good. Constantly having to think about my sequences and are they working? And I hated all of it. And I am at a place in my life right now where I'm like, I want less. I want less stuff. I want less hassle. I want less tools. I want less everything. And I really just want to be able to say, how do I give? How do I create? How do I put it out there? And trust the people who appreciate that will reward me. And it's working. Is it going like super fast? No. Am I making tons of money? No, but I am now making money to email, not paying to email. So the people who tell me it doesn't work, it's working for me. It's working for me. And I'm also getting clients.
Yeah, which is the goal, right? To create that community, to create engagement, to yes, get leads from that community. And if that wasn't happening for you before, then that's not working. Finding a different way that does feel good, that is easier, right, for us. I think so often we put, like you said, those shoulds on ourselves, or other people put those shoulds on us of what business has to look like. And having been in the online space for so long, I'm coming up on 9 years. I have seen a lot of those bigger name people whittle down their businesses because, and I think I don't talk to them, but I'm assuming that it is because of this reason that they are like, why am I doing all of this? To what end is this going to get me? Yes, I'm making all this money and I'm doing all this stuff. But if my home life is lacking, or if I'm having issues, or I am resenting these people, something has to give. And I think a lot of people are coming to realize that business doesn't have to look one way. The online business doesn't have to look one way. You get to decide what that looks like for you. And it takes time sometimes. Like you said, you were in that fight with yourself for quite a bit. So
And I don't think that stuff works the way it used to. And they're still trying to sell that it does. So they can't stop doing it or saying it because they're still selling you products saying, hey, the webinar lead funnel, blah, blah, blah works. And guess what? It doesn't work. The pandemic changed everything. Post 2020 and pre 2020 for online business looks so different. And people who are still trying to cling to the things that worked before 2020, 2021, they're struggling. Those are the people I think you're talking about. The ones that I have seen that are continuing to have success have adapted and changed and recognized that what I've noticed, and most people I know notice, is that what is selling or what works right now is like old fashioned relationship stuff. How can I be in relationship with people? And that's one of the things I love about the podcast and Substack is that they feel more relational than just sending mass emails constantly that are just like trying like a veiled sales pitch. People are tired of that. They are done with it. I think one of the reasons so many people are subscribed to so many Substacks who are finding it, and it doesn't have to just be Substack. That's a popular platform, but there's others. But people they're looking for longer form content. They're looking for more depth and stuff that's interesting. They're looking for community, which Substack offers so that they can go and actually have conversations, not just with the author, but other people who appreciate what that author is saying or have things to say around it. And the podcast is another way to help deepen that relationship between you and your listener. I think those kinds of things are what work now. And the
yeah,
people who are still clinging to the old, like, let me have a webinar or a masterclass that leads you into this funnel, or the funnel that leads to the webinar that leads to the pitch. Like, people are seeing through it. They're done with it. They don't want to be constantly sold to. And there's a way to sell that doesn't have to feel like pressure and manipulation. And
yeah.
I feel like for me, the podcast and the Substack lend themselves really well to that.
I love that you were able to discover that for yourself, right? Like, because I don't think that, like you're saying, so many people are holding on to that old way of doing things. And it's also why I don't follow a lot of business coaches or business leaders, because I really like to pave my own way and lean into what feels good. And if something's not working, then I know that I need to, okay, am I still on the right path? Yeah. All right. We just got to get through this. Business takes time. It takes effort. And to think that it's just something easy to just, go on Instagram Live and sell all my stuff doesn't work like that anymore.
Yeah. And I also, part of it was realizing for me, the way I coach is exactly what you're saying. Well, first of all, I'm a coach in the true sense of a coach. Like, I am not a strategist and a consultant. I'm not trying to sell people a system that works or like, here's the 5-step plan to getting 1,000 leads or whatever. Like, that's not me. I'm a coach. I hold space. I ask questions. I reflect things back, and I help people find their own internal knowing of what's right for them to make decisions that are grounded in their values, in what they need, right? And how they want to show up and what feels good. That is what I do. And I started to recognize too that when I was sitting here using ConvertKit, and this is not shade on ConvertKit, they're actually doing a lot of things to be more like Substack. Point being, the way I was showing up, doing the things I thought I was supposed to do, I got to a place of realizing, how can I, in good conscience, be coaching people to help them buck the system, do what feels right for them, and find success in that. And my clients do. They find success when they can let go of that stuff and show up as themselves. And how can I do that when I'm still clinging on to some of these shoulds? of like saying, oh, well, no, I can't. It's too scary to move to Substack because I'm supposed to do ConvertKit and I've got to have my email funnels and all of that. I had to say no. If I'm going to tell people or work with people towards letting go of all of that stuff and saying, how do I want my business to feel and what helps me make that happen? I got to do the same thing for myself. And so that's what those moves also were about, was like all of this was happening at the same time. And me being like, no, I cannot be doing a podcast talking about doing business differently and then showing up and still holding on to some of these things where I'm like, oh, but I better not get that different. That's too scary. No, I got to do it. I got to do it.
Yeah, this has been so good. And I hope it opens people's eyes to realize that with a podcast, with your email list, with business, we don't have to do it all the same way. Lean into what feels right for you and what works for you, and let all the rest fall to the wayside. Quite frankly, you don't need it.
Yeah. Can I mention two more really quick things about the podcast? Just
Yeah.
because one, I want to say one of the things I started doing with season 2 of the show, I recognized, hey, there's more opportunity here for Substack and the podcast to feed each other. And so I started adding bonus content that only subscribers of the newsletter get. And I mention it in the episodes. I hint at what it's going to be about. I give them that and I tell them, hey, subscribe to the newsletter to get the bonus content. So every week, one of the benefits of subscribing is you're getting bonus content that you're not going to get on the regular podcast. You don't have to pay me. This is for free subscribers. Some people might decide to make that part of their paid option. But for me, I'm doing it as free just because I want to get, want to have that like synergy between the two things. So that's another idea I just want to put out there for people if they choose to think about this sort of a model. There's probably even more options I haven't yet like explored. And I'm going to keep thinking about what else, how else do I challenge these and do it differently? And the other thing I just want to mention, I don't do regular ads. I don't want to take corporate ads. I don't want to have any of that. What I do though, is I run ads for other people's podcasts that I know who share my value system. And hopefully I'll be able to run one of your ads in my show. My goal is to say, how can I help uplift other people? And yes, I hope that they'll run my ads sometimes. Some of them do, but I also do it if they don't, because I really think that another way to get leads from your podcast is to not just think about how do I get my listeners to become leads, but how do I forge relationships that can help create leads? So for me, my listeners may not become my clients, but those people whose ads I run on my show, they're going to remember me. They're going to talk about me. When somebody needs a coach, they're going to say, oh, you need to talk to her, right? If you're looking for somebody who shares your values, I know Becky and I know she's a good person. Like I show up and I give. And I just want to point out for people to think about your podcast for lead generation beyond just how do I get these listeners to come pay me, but also what are other ways that you could use this as a tool in your business for the larger goal of marketing yourself and networking, and what are all the other possibilities? I think we can get really like fixated on just like, how do I get these listeners to sign up for my opt-in and get onto my email list, blah, blah, blah. And that's fine. But there are many more ways to use your podcast to get people into your orbit than just that. And so I just want to always encourage people to think outside the box. And that's definitely my goal. And I'm hoping to find even more ways, but I just wanted to throw that out there too.
Yes, that is such a good recommendation. I love the idea, especially as an introvert, because I don't want to go to the live events. They stress me out. They drain my energy. So big live events don't feel good, but one-on-one conversations, those feel really good. And so even your guests, how can you take that relationship further? No, you don't always have to turn them into leads, but you can turn them into collaborators, connectors, potentially clients, but you can turn those relationships into so much more while still providing value to your listeners as well. There's so many ways to do it. So thank you for sharing that for sure. If people are like, yes, Becky is talking my language and I need to go check out what she's doing, where can people go to find your podcast, subscribe to your Substack, all of that fun stuff?
You can go to feministfounders.co, not com. I couldn't get that one, and I'm not paying whoever's sitting on it tens of thousands of dollars for it. But you can go to feministfounders.co, C-O, and there you can find both the newsletter and the podcast and how those things overlap and sign up for both. There's also, I do monthly community forums for my paid subscribers, so you can see some of the other benefits if you decide to upgrade to paid. But even for free, you'll get the bonus podcast content.
Awesome. Thank you. And we'll make sure that we have that linked correctly in the show notes as well. That way people who are driving or whatever else can go back and find that if they need to. Becky, thank you so much. This has been so good.
Thank you for having me. I love talking podcasts.